if you start thinking about politics in an intellectual way, you are likely to be on the left. Because that provides a systematic solution, an answer to the questions, puts it all in a system, and also gives you a rather dignified and self-congratulatory place in the system. But once you started thinking, if you think a bit harder and longer about it, you'll move back to what you would have been if you had never thought at all. You know, and that's my view as what an intellectual conservative is. It's someone who articulates the real reasons for not having reasons.
Say that again.
Someone who articulates the real reasons for not having reasons, but just feeling and doing what's right.
Right. Well, I think, I think it's Yeats. Yeats has a wonderful poem, Easter 1916. And in there he has the "Come let us mock at the great that had such burdens on the mind and toiled so hard and late to leave some monument behind." He wrote that when he witnessed some Irish revolutionaries destroy a beautiful house of a very wealthy landed English, Anglo-Irish person. And in a lot of ways that poem articulates that idea that it's very easy to destroy and tear down. And I think one of the things that's so tempting for many people, because the world is so troubling to so many people, and so many people suffer in this world, and a lot of what the liberal left tends to rely on is that sense of indignation that a lot of idealistic people feel, because there are things that are deeply wrong with the world. But then when we look historically at how, when these people have gotten into power, but when they get into power, they tend to really, really tear things down and don't give us
Well, I think there's an explanation of this. It's what Hegel calls the labor of the negative.
Right.
The initial instinct on the left is that negative instinct, that things are wrong. And they must be rectified. They can only be rectified, however, by the seizure of power. And so we're going to seize power in order to rectify them. But once you've got the power, the negative is still there in your heart, because it's driven you all along. You know, that's the thing which has inspired you. So you set about destroying things, punishing people. You find classes who are to blame. You know, the Jews, the bourgeoisie, whoever it might be, and you don't get out of that negative structure.
Right.
And I feel that's what I felt very strongly in 1968. You know, that of course there are things that are wrong in France, but there are also things that are beautiful and right, and you've got to go through this and come back and rescue those things, which is much more important than destroying a few obstacles along the way.
Right. Blake has a interesting, he says, "The hand of vengeance found the bed to which the purple tyrant fled. The iron hand crushed the head and came a tyrant in its stead." And that tends to be a pattern that we see again and again, that if you have, for instance, in Iran's a good example of that. I mean, Savak was one of the major reasons for the revolution itself, because the heavy-handedness of the Shah, his secret police, which he probably had no idea. They very often live in these silos and bubbles. But they've got, the secret police, the apparatus all comes back. And the disappearing, the people that disappear all disappear again. So, I mean, this is part of the problem. But again, it's still this fundamental problem. For instance, I mean, one of the things that you talk about in Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands is the idea of power being the way in which everything is articulated. The critique is about power. I mean, Foucault's a good example of that, of somebody who just saw everything in terms of power. But there's definitely truth embodied in that, and I think that's why it's so seductive for so many people. I mean, we have to deal with the fact that so many people are seduced by this because they experience, especially marginalized and disenfranchised people.
Yes, that is true. But of course, in the intellectual world, it's extremely corrupting to see things in this Foucauldian way. Instead of asking the question, is what Hamza saying true? I ask the question, what power is advancing behind that? You then disappear from the picture,
right.
and also what you've said disappears from
Right.
the picture.
Yeah.
I'm no longer engaging with you, I to thou, at all,
Right.
because without the concept of truth, there is no real engagement between people. All I am seeing is the power that's speaking through you, and that, of course, you can look at the whole of culture in that way, which is essentially what the postmodern curriculum is.
Right.
Taking one writer, one philosopher, one musician after another, and just talking about, like Susan McClary on Beethoven. This is fantasies of rape speaking through this
Right.
music.
Right.
It's extremely boring after a while because it's totally mechanical.
It's a lens. I mean, one of the things I say about critical theorists, that if it was a lens, that it might be useful sometimes to just peer through that lens, but it's a corneal transplant.
That's a good metaphor. As I was saying earlier, the purely negative approach to the status quo is simply going to perpetuate this negativity, and has done. If you're not... The typical conservative, in my reading of events, is someone who looks around himself and he finds things that he loves. And he thinks, well, those things are threatened, they're vulnerable,
right.
I've got to protect them.
Right.
And it's not often that you find on the left somebody who looks around and finds things that he loves. It's always something that's gone wrong, something that is even hateful, and you've got to mobilize against it. If you've lost any sense that actually the world is lovable, and that there are things therefore to be rescued in it, you have actually lost the sense of why there is such a thing as a community in the first place. And that, I think, is one of the things that I felt very strongly throughout my life, that there really are wonderful things that we've inherited. All Americans, whatever position in society they are still heirs to something rather remarkable. A rule of law which goes on perpetuating itself from generation to generation. If only people knew how rare that was, they would see that they've got to fight to preserve it. And the same with so many other institutions that we inherited.
I couldn't agree with you more.